So welcome back, everybody. And I'm going to turn the introductions for this session over to Joyce Newland.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to introduce 4 speakers today from Federal Highways Office of Natural Environment and Office of Planning. And we thank them very much for coming today and giving us a presentation. I think it's going to play very nicely off of what we just heard from Dr. Dukes. Thank you very much. That was very informative. I'm going to introduce Becky Lupes. She's an environmental specialist with the Office of Natural Environment, and she is a member of the Sustainable Transportation and Resilience team. She has overseen the pilot project in which transportation agencies address and assess the natural hazards of resilience on their transportation infrastructure. And she also led the development of the Federal Highways Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Framework. Heather Holsinger is also an environmental specialist with the Office of Natural Environment and too on the Sustainable Transportation Resilience team. She is involved in policy development in the areas of transportation system resilience, sustainability, and alternative fueled vehicles. Before she came to Federal Highways, she served as a senior policy fellow with the Pew Center on Global Climate Change, and she was also a senior analyst for the Government Accounting Office. Corbin Davis, he is a community planner with Federal Highways Office of Planning, Environment, and Realty. He is a national leader in transportation performance measures and planning for the state DOTs and MPOs. He is a member of the Planning Oversight and Stewardship team. Before he came to headquarters, he was with the Georgia and Tennessee divisions. Jim Thorne, no stranger to Indiana. He is he is in the Office of Planning and is on the Transportation Planning Capacity Building team, and he is involved in efforts to develop and deliver training, technical assistance, and support deployment, technology deployment, pardon me, Jim. And he is also supports research projects across a range of transportation planning issues. Prior to Federal Highway, Jim was with 2 MPOs that have Indiana connections. So this session is pretty much going to tag team off of a lot of things Dr. Dukes talked about, but it's going to highlight the natural hazards of natural hazard resilient challenges that transportation systems are facing and highlight ways agencies can assess and address proactively these challenges in their transportation planning processes. So thank you very much.
Okay, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Joyce, for those introductions. I'm Heather Holsinger with the Federal Highways headquarters, as Joyce mentioned. And I want to apologize from the outset that I have a lot of ambient noise going on, construction, and also they decided to take a tree out in the neighborhood, so I'm so sorry about that. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Maybe just a quick sound check. Can you hear me, guys? Yeah, okay, thank you. Okay, great. All right, and Corbin has graciously agreed to be our slide host for today. So Corbin, could you advance the next slide, please? Great. So what is resilience? It's a question that comes up from the outset always, and it's a question that is a good one because a lot of folks have different definitions of resilience, and we have one at Federal Highways. It was defined in an order that I'll talk about in just a second, and that's our definition right there. You'll see that it does include some of the concepts that Dr. Dukes alluded to in the first session this morning on adapting, but it's pretty broad. And it can apply to a lot of different concepts. We're going to be talking mostly today about the natural hazard side, so extreme weather events, and what it means to start to work towards being resilient to those types of risks and threats. But you'll probably hear it talked about, in the cybersecurity world with reference to COVID, I just heard my son's teacher talk about being resilient to him, so with the challenges of virtual learning. So it's a term that you hear often, but we're going to focus today on the concept of resilience as it applies to extreme weather events, and in particular the transportation sector. But you know, I think for the MPO folks on the call, it's really important to also think about it in terms of other sectors and how, you know, transportation can play an important role in increasing the resilience of an entire community, in a city, a state. There's a lot of ways to think about resilience. So I encourage you to think broadly as well as narrowly when it comes to the transportation system. Okay, next slide, Corbin. Great. So what are we going to focus on? Well, I'm going to show a couple of slides that are a little bit, I guess, depressing. NOAA is keeping track of some of the disasters that have happened over the last, well, actually, I think they tracked the data back to the 80s. They've been developing a series of really interesting maps over the last decade or so that talks about the various disasters across the country and shows just those disasters that have resulted in $1 billion each in terms of damage and destruction. So it doesn't capture many of the other events that happen throughout the year that are smaller, maybe even just slightly smaller in terms of the damage that happens as a result of this. But as you can see here, this was just last year, I think our map is starting to look probably similar, sadly, for 2020. When you think about the California wildfires that are happening right now, what's happening in the Gulf Coast in terms of storms that have already hit this year. So, I like to show these slides towards the beginning so we maybe get a little bit motivated to think about some of the impacts that we're already seeing right now across the country. As Dr. Dukes talked about some of the changes that may happen going forward, there's, we may be in for more of this or who knows, maybe worse. So it really behooves us to start thinking about these risks and threats as much as we can initially as we move forward. And then Corbin, if you could go to the next slide as well. This is going to show us what happened 2 years ago in 2018. Almost a similar picture again, some of the same threats you're seeing over and over again in certain parts of the country. And so I think this helps to illustrate some of the challenges and also, again, to try to get us a little bit motivated and doing things a little bit differently as we move forward with our planning and our project development and even our operations and maintenance activities in the transportation sector. Next slide. So what happens when you see these disasters that were pretty generic? Obviously, in the last couple of slides, those disasters impacted not just the transportation sector, but everything in our communities. And these are a few snapshots of what happens to the transportation system in some of these events, and from the wildfires and the evacuations and the flooding in the Midwest. This is a picture from Iowa. These are actually pretty old pictures. The one on the far right there is in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy in New York City. But again, if you turn on the news most evenings, you see similar pictures, unfortunately, across the country of some of the impacts on our transportation system. Okay, so that's it with the gloom and doom. I think we want to sort of turn towards what we're starting to think about and do in terms of becoming more resilient to some of these threats, ways that we can start to think about planning differently, building better differently throughout our communities and in our transportation system. And the Department of Transportation as a whole has, as part of its current strategic plan, so this is our 2018 to 2022 strategic plan, that we will work to increase the effectiveness of our infrastructure and making sure that it's resilient to withstand some of these extreme weather. And our team at Federal Highways Headquarters has been working with folks across the country for over 10 years now in thinking of ways to do that, to become more resilient. Next slide, Courtney. So one of the things that we want to focus on really is a lot of the work that's happening across the country over the past decade or so that transportation agencies and others have worked together to do to start building that resilience. And so that's what my colleagues are going to be talking about, ways to do that in various sectors and also in the various aspects of transportation decision making. But to just sort of address the I guess the gorilla in the room, the thing that we hear and the concern that we hear most often is, how do we pay for a lot of this work, right? And that's a very valid concern. We clearly have challenged just, maintaining our current infrastructure as it is. So one thing I did want to highlight just from the outset, and I think you'll hear a little bit more about this later, is just that most adaptation activities are eligible for federal highways funding. And there's a link within this slide, and I think you'll get copies of the slide, and you may even be able to actively link to it now, where we have a memo that talks about some of those funding streams that are eligible for adaptation activities. And I also wanted to mention that we do have some specific regulations that direct us now to consider resilience. For example, in asset management plans, state DOTs must develop a transportation asset management plan that does consider resilience and extreme weather events and how to address those risks. Transportation plans also, resilience is a planning factor now. You'll hear more about that later in the presentation. On the emergency relief side, again, requirements to think about resilience and think about existing assets that are repeatedly damaged and how we can start to rebuild those different and better going forward. I mentioned Federal Highways Order 5520 is the one I was talking about earlier. This was developed in December of 2014 and it's still in the books. And that is an internal order for federal highways that directs us to integrate resilience into all of our policies and planning and procedures. But sort of a trickle down effect, it does provide some direction for us to additionally, work with our partners to help to do that as well. So you'll hear more about some of the research that we've been doing. We do have technical assistance available to help folks in thinking about how to address resilience in their work in the transportation world. And we have a lot of really good information there on that website at the very bottom of the slide. Essentially, most of the work that we're going to talk about today, you can find that if you go to that particular link. And Corbin, next slide. So I mentioned we're really trying to think about integrating resilience into all aspects of transportation decision making. And so if you think about it, from this sort of life cycle of planning, project level over through operations and maintenance, and then back again as we collect information, on the operations and maintenance side about how these extreme events are starting to impact our existing infrastructure, you can take that information, integrate that back into the planning process. And so these are some of the things that we're going to talk about a little bit more today. On the planning side, resilience and asset management and the planning process, obviously it's going to be a huge focus of the second half of this presentation. Becky's going to talk a little bit about the project level aspects, and Dr. Dukes talked about, how do we design bridges differently or pavements, and Becky's going to mention some of the resources that are that we have available to help folks start to think about doing exactly that. And then on the operations and maintenance side, we'll talk a little bit about emergency response in that aspect of thinking about resilience. So I apologize, I had to be sort of the doom and gloom person, but I want to turn it over to Becky to talk about all the really great work that's happening across the country to make us more resilient as a transportation community. And I think, there's a lot for folks in Indiana to think about how to go about doing that. So thanks for your time this morning, and over to you, Becky.
Great, thanks so much, Heather, and thanks to everyone in Indiana for having us this morning. This is great. So Corbin, next slide, please. Oh, no, this slide. So as one of the ways that we're helping to, at Federal Highways, we're hoping to help support and inform the efforts to improve the resilience of the transportation system around the country. We've really embraced this approach of partnering with transportation agencies across the country on applied research projects, which we call our pilot projects. And we've funded several rounds of these pilots over the past decades, all with a little bit of a different focus. Some agencies have conducted vulnerability assessments or analyzed adaptation options. We've looked at using nature-based solutions for coastal resilience, incorporating resilience into transportation asset management and into agency practices. And so next slide. Next slide, Corbin. So this is an example of one of these assessments. This is North Central Texas Council of Government, the Dallas-Fort Worth area's MPO. And one of the things that they did, they were interested in just a a vulnerability of their existing and their planned transportation infrastructure in their planning area. So they partnered with the University of Texas for historical and future climate information. And it sounds like you all in Indiana have a wealth of information from Purdue. So then the Transportation Agency collected the data on their assets, and they looked at each asset's criticality to regional mobility. And they looked at which assets were in the 100-year floodplain. One of their findings was that they had over 600 miles of roads in the region that had the potential to be inundated by a 100-year flood. They also found that the future increases in temperature compounded by projected decrease in annual rainfall in that region may reduce soil moisture, which could cause pavement cracking and stresses on bridges and culverts. So then they plan to use what they learned in this assessment to incorporate into their transportation plan and in project prioritization. Next slide, Corbin. The Hillsborough, Florida MPO, I realize they are very different from Indiana in vulnerabilities that they're concerned about, but aspects of what they did are definitely transferable. So as part of their assessment, one of the things they did was they compared they looked at vulnerabilities similar to what NCT-COG did, but they also looked at what's the potential. They used the REMI economic model, and they looked at the potential economic loss from not making any adaptation improvements. And they looked at potential options that they could undertake. This is definitely at the planning level, and they looked at, maybe at a medium level of investment, what economic benefits via avoided losses compared to the cost of those strategies could they net. And then they looked at, what would it look like if they went with a high adaptation level. So, this is very sketch level, planning level, but it gave them an idea about the potential benefits by making some adaptation actions in that area. Next slide. Connecticut DOT, they were looking at one county in the northwest corner of their state, an inland county. It's a very rural county where they have some flooding issues, and they were interested in flooding associated with extreme rainfall. And what do their current, the bridges and culverts that they have in place right now, their structures, how can they handle, how might they do as they are currently designed, and is there any excess capacity for potential future increases in precipitation and increases in flows? So they analyzed every single bridge and culvert in that district that was, and then they analyzed the hydraulic capacity, and then they came up with some, a list of, they also looked at the criticality of the structure. So this, as I said, this is really a rural area of the state, so some roads don't have alternative routes, some do, but some don't, and they looked at access to health facilities, for example, like a dialysis center that some residents depend on. And so with this information, they have this information of criticality, they have this information about which structures are currently hydraulically adequate and which might need some improvements. They can go forward with a plan for which structures they may want to address. Next slide. So we've funded many pilot projects and have some lessons learned on what makes a successful project. First, every study, successful studies have a clear objective. What are you trying to find out? What is it that you're most concerned about? And a manageable scope. Think of this as one piece in a broader long-term effort to improve the resilience of your transportation system. So, maybe if you have not done an analysis of your flooding vulnerabilities, a large-scale analysis, maybe that's something to do as a first step, or map where what facilities are in the floodplain. Or maybe you're interested in certain highly critical assets and you want to drill down deeper into a smaller area. Also, successful projects provide useful information of enduring value. So to make it used, if you actually want your results to be used, the people that you hope will use these results, you want to have them on board. So incorporate them, information from them, talk with them, have them included in, as you go along the way in whatever assessment you're doing. Also, just collecting a lot of asset data. A lot of transportation agencies might not know where all their assets are, like all their culverts. If the culvert's not permitted, maybe they don't know where that is. You might not have the elevation of your road bed. So, there's some of this asset data you could use. Once you collect it, you might be able to use it for other things as well. In exposure maps can be useful for other agencies as well. If you get an exposure map of where your flooding vulnerabilities are, the transportation folks aren't the only ones that are interested in that. So maps and other information, identifying vulnerable assets can be useful in many stages of transportation decision making. So just think about, what can this be used for, not just creating some kind of on-the-shelf study. Okay, next slide. So we have this resource, a document called the Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Framework. And so it's now in its 3rd edition. And this document provides a somewhat structured process to guide agencies through the process of assessing natural hazard vulnerabilities, evaluating adaptation options, and then incorporating what you find into agency decisions. So rather than being very prescriptive, we include multiple approaches for going about each step, for collecting data and analyzing it and incorporating it into decision making. It's basically a collection of what we've learned through all these pilot projects and other work that other agencies have done around the country and other research. And so we try to gather it into one place, but then it has links to other related resources and tools that could be helpful. It's a static document, but we do try to update it regularly. So I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in doing a vulnerability assessment, and it's up on our website. We'll have the link here in our presentation in a minute. Okay, next slide. Wanted to mention we have another round of pilot projects going on right now. These agencies are doing a variety of things. Some of them are using existing tools to do a vulnerability assessment. Some of them are looking at ways to integrate resilience and durability into their agency practices. For example, Caltrans had already done a vulnerability assessment in each of their districts. So now they're working on, they developed a communications guide to help get the information out to people who need it. Or some agencies are deploying a resilient solution and monitoring performance. Corpus Christi MPO is actually partnered with the county and developed a living shoreline to go to along the coast for a county road. So they were going to do some work on this county road anyway, and so Corpus Christi, as part of their pilot, they designed and now they're implementing this living shoreline to help protect the coastal road. Next slide, please. So for information on these pilot projects and actually a whole host of other work that our office is involved in, there's a link to our website. There's a spot where we post all the information from the various rounds of pilot projects, which includes their final reports. We, as part of doing these pilots, we ask agencies to put together a final report on what they did, what they found, what their lessons learned were into a document designed to share with other agencies that are interested in doing things like this. And each pilot also has a summary report, a 4-page summary, if you'd like the quick version. So that's all up on our website. So I encourage you to look there. We also have an email list through what we call Gov Delivery. It's the federal government's email mechanism, I guess, or email blast mechanism. And so there's a spot to sign up for emails and messages from the resources that our team develops. Okay, next slide. So we've developed a lot of resources. We've used what we learned through these pilot projects to not only develop the vulnerability assessment and adaptation framework, but many other resources as well. I'm going to highlight just a few of them. And again, I encourage you to take a look on our website just to have access to all these resources and even more. Next slide. So one of the rounds of pilots focused on incorporating resilience into asset management. And so also, Heather had mentioned earlier, this is one of the requirements. Actually, state DOTs are now required to incorporate resilience consideration into their asset management plans. So FHWA is working on development of a handbook on integrating resilience into asset management, which was informed by the pilots and other work. So hopefully we'll have this out this year, but I'm not quite sure on that yet. But it's designed for having tips on how might agencies incorporate resilience into their asset management. Next slide. We also had a big project called the Transportation Engineering Approaches to Climate Resilience Study, which involved many case studies, and also so we developed many case studies out of it. We also developed this guidebook, which is called the Synthesis of Approaches for Addressing Resilience in Project Development. And it's really looking at the early stages in project development. Overall, it has overall lessons learned from various engineering disciplines. It's not for engineering design, it's more preliminary engineering stage. But if you're looking at how you might incorporate climate resilience into a project, I recommend that you look at this, take a look at this handbook. Next slide. We also have hydraulic engineering circulars. There's several hydraulic engineering circulars that the agency develops, and one is particularly relevant, I think, to Indiana because you had a lot of flooding issues. And so HEC 17, this is in the second version now. I think this version came out in 2016. It goes over a regulatory foundation for resilient design, what are the current regulations and policies, overview of typical hydrologic design methods. It has some climate science 101 and modeling, talks about defining risk, talks about evaluating facilities over a range of events versus a single design event, some strategies to reduce vulnerability and increase resilience. It has a kind of a 5-level vulnerability and risk assessment framework within it, depending on the maybe importance of the facility. And then it has several case studies to illustrate the levels of these assessments. The Connecticut DOT pilot that I mentioned earlier is highlighted in this guide as one example of something that states can do. So I encourage you to, again, have your engineers check out this guide to help address flooding issues on some transportation facilities. So next slide. So, how can you as planners help make resilience improvements happen? So these are, we've had a lot, Heather mentioned it as having a lot of doom and gloom, and I think I've had a lot of agencies analyzing their vulnerabilities, but what we want are things like on the right side of this slide. Like on the left, we have this example of, there was a culvert that washed out. This culvert washed out multiple times. It washed out in 1990 and then again in 2015. It was a road that repeatedly floods. In the end, TxDOT did an analysis, and they determined that in the long term, it would make more economic sense to replace it with a bridge. And so they did. This was called a betterment after an emergency relief project. And I realized, in Indiana, you've had a lot of flooding. I took a look at some of the recent emergency relief, and it looked like you had severe storms and flooding in 2008, 2011, 2014, 2018, and then And I looked at the impact across the state, and out of 92 counties, it looked like only 36 weren't affected by these emergency declarations or something like that. And there was a government share of the federal highway share estimate of the repair damage, to be over $22 million, and this is just in the past, a little over a decade. And so, we want to make these resilience improvements, but then, we can't make them smart. How do you know where to make these improvements? And so that's a lot of the hard work that these agencies around the country are doing to try to assess where does it make most sense, what's most critical, where does it make most economic sense to implement these improvements, because money is tight everywhere. The picture below is in California, and Metropolitan Transportation Commission is the MPO for the San Francisco Bay Area. And there's a facility there that has frequent flooding, SH37, and they have, it also has traffic issues, so multiple issues, and so they had developed a corridor study with many partners, work together on this corridor study to look at what improvements they can make, and they ended up deciding to take a two-phase approach. There are certain things they can do in the near term and certain things to implement in the longer term, and so that's a really cool success story. Well, hopefully if it all comes through and they can implement it. But it looked like they were able to find a great resilient solution with having many people involved. There are lots of ecological considerations, traffic considerations, climate considerations, and it's a great case study. And Federal Highways gave it one of our environmental excellence awards in 2018. So we have a write-up about that on our website. Next slide, Thorne. So, back to regulation. So I think Heather mentioned this briefly. There's a requirement that it was actually in MAP 21, the two transportation bills ago, but we have regulations now where states need to evaluate alternatives to mitigate damage to roads and bridges that have been repeatedly repaired due to emergency events, like that culvert that I showed in the last slide. And they have to do these analyses for all national highway system roads, highways, and bridges right now. That started a couple of years ago, but the thing that's very important for you all to know is that all highways, including non-national highway system facilities, need to be evaluated prior to their inclusion in a STIP, starting this November. So if a facility has had repeated damage, it won't be able to be included in a STIP. So presumably an MPO's TIP, until it's had some evaluation of alternatives. So this is designed to avoid, well, I don't know, Congress required it, but the point of this is to try to look before this damage happens yet again, to have agencies make a hard look at potential alternatives. So there's a question and answer about that. There's a link at the bottom of the slide, but something to know, something to be aware of. And if Indiana DOT probably has some of these analyses that they could share with you just to help you determine whether the projects that are programmed in your TIP and STIP might be affected. And I think that is all I had. That concludes the bit of the presentation that Heather and I were going to do before we turn it over to how you can incorporate all this into your transportation planning processes, which Corbin will pick up. So with that, are there any questions for Heather and me?
Currently, there are no questions.
Thank you, Becky and Heather. And hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I hope you're doing well wherever you're calling in from. Again, I'm Corbin Davis, and I work in Federal Highways Office of Planning in our headquarters office in Washington, D.C. And Heather and Becky have already mentioned a lot of important reasons to consider resilience in your planning and decision making, from protecting your previous investments to protecting the safety and security of the traveling public. Another reason that it's important to bring resilience into your planning is that it's now a requirement for both MPOs and state DOTs. Looking at MPOs, resiliency is now one of our 10 planning factors to consider as part of your planning process. This means considering projects, strategies, services that will improve the resiliency and reliability of your region's transportation system and also mitigate stormwater impacts. How this is done is rather flexible. It can mean bringing resilience into your long-range metropolitan transportation plan or your transportation improvement program, also known as your TIP, or it can mean bringing resilience into your unified planning work programs and your stakeholder engagement activities. The second item listed here is a recommendation that you consult with agencies and officials responsible for natural disaster risk reduction when developing your long-range plans and your TIPs. At the federal level, this could be FEMA or the Army Corps of Engineers. At the state level, this could be the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. And these agencies can play a big role in providing data, helping you provide expertise, and it can also help you support your implementation efforts. The third requirement here is for MPOs to evaluate capital investment strategies and other types of strategies in your long-range transportation plans to reduce the vulnerability of existing infrastructure to natural disasters such as intense rainfall events, flooding, landslides, wildfires, tornadoes, or earthquakes. And MPOs are not alone in this requirement to look at resilience in the planning process. State DOTs also have similar requirements to address resilience. State DOTs are also required to look at the same 10 planning factors as MPOs, so they must also consider projects and strategies and services that will improve resiliency and reliability and to mitigate stormwater impacts. In addition to that, as states develop their own long-range statewide transportation plans, they are required to either reference or to summarize any emergency relief and disaster preparedness plans that were relevant to the development of the state DOT's plan. So that means if the state DOT uses a hazard mitigation plan to inform its policies and investments, we would expect to see that acknowledgement in their long-range transportation plan. So these requirements are very similar to the requirements for MPOs. And in many states across the country, we see situations where the state DOTs take an active leadership role in helping their MPOs and their local partners bring resilience into their planning efforts, whether it's through interagency coordination or through data collection or funding. And we at Federal Highway, we've also taken a leadership role in planning for resilience. As Heather and Becky already have mentioned, we've been involved in an ongoing series of research over the past decade with a lot of different pilot projects and studies. And with these, we've had workshops and peer exchanges, both related to these pilots and other efforts to provide technical assistance to Federal Highway Division offices and to state DOTs and MPOs. If you check out our resilience website, which again is shown at the bottom of the screen here, you'll find a fact sheet and a white paper that we put together specifically focusing on resilience in the planning process. We're also putting the final touches on a new handbook on integrating natural hazard resilience into the transportation planning process. This handbook is still a work in progress at the moment. Our goal is to release it by the end of this calendar year, but it might have to wait until early 2021. But when that's ready, we'll be sure to share that widely, and it will be available on our website for download. But through this project and all of our research, we've seen a variety of ways that states and MPOs have brought resilience into their planning processes. So I'm going to talk about some of our findings here and walk you through a typical planning process to share some opportunities for bringing resilience into your procedures, into your documentation, and into your policy and investment decisions to help you build stronger, more robust, more reliable transportation systems and to help you meet these federal requirements for planning. So I'll start at the top of this diagram and move clockwise around these 8 items, going one by one from goals, objectives, performance measures and targets, to problems, needs and solutions, to transportation plans, studies and improvement programs, and then to project development, monitoring and reporting. As you already know, transportation planning is a continuous iterative process, so each part of this process informs the others, and there are feedback loops and opportunities for stakeholder engagement throughout this entire process. And as you look at these recommendations, keep in mind that you can step into this process at any point based on where you are in your own planning cycle, whether you're updating your long-range plan or your TIP, or if you're starting at square one. So you don't have to necessarily start at the top. But let's look at the opportunities for considering resilience when developing goals, objectives, performance measures, and targets. So let me orient you to this slide first. I'm going to use it for the next couple slides. We're all going to use the same design. Again, the title bar is going to reference one of the 8 components of that typical planning process. And then the columns underneath will lay out typical subcomponents. And within each of these subcomponents, there are bullets with some possible ways that you and your planning partners can bring resilience into your planning. These are all recommendations based on what we've seen in our research. And the idea here is that these recommendations provide a menu for you to consider moving forward. Certainly, you can implement all of these if you have the time and money and resources, but the idea here is that you can find the recommendations that best fit your local context, your local needs, and your available resources. And chances are that you are already doing a lot of these things, so there might be opportunities for you to improve these things or to continue doing what you're already doing. Then at the bottom of the screen, I'll highlight some example practices from MPOs across the country to give you a sense of what your peers are doing. We look for examples that resonate with your situation in Indiana as a mostly landlocked state in the Midwest in the Great Lakes region. We also included some coastal examples from places in Massachusetts, Florida, California, because you can adapt these examples to meet your own planning process. So if you have determined that natural hazards and changing conditions might affect your ability to meet your current goals, objectives, measures, and targets in the future, you might consider revising those goals or developing new goals to account for resilience in your planning process. You might also look at updating your existing objectives or developing new objectives focusing on resilience efforts. You also might consider developing performance measures and targets to help you measure resilience and to track your progress implementing projects and strategies and your progress in achieving your goals and objectives. For peer examples, you could look to your neighbors in Madison, Wisconsin, and the Madison Area Transportation Planning Board and their goal to reduce the vulnerability of the public and the region's transportation infrastructure to natural hazards. Personally, I like this goal because it talks about protecting both your people and your transportation assets. I could also look at the Fayette-Raleigh MPO, a small MPO in Summersville, West Virginia, and they have objectives in their planning process for setting aside funding for maintenance projects and activities, for prioritizing projects that upgrade substandard infrastructure, and for improving stormwater management along their roadway system. And then also you might look at the Miami-Dade Transportation Planning Organization in Florida and their use of a performance measure to track roadways that are located within FEMA's 100-year floodplain. And so overall, your goals, objectives, measures, and targets are the foundation of your planning process and will influence how you make your investment in policy decisions. The next opportunity for considering resilience is when you're defining your problems and needs for your region. A strong understanding of your region's problems and needs can help you identify the key areas to focus on throughout your planning process. So you could start by reviewing existing information in previous planning documents or research to identify known risks and vulnerabilities related to natural hazards, perhaps from your own agency or one of your state or local planning partners or through a university or non-governmental organization. To gain a better understanding of the vulnerability of your network to natural hazards, you might also consider conducting a natural hazard exposure screen or a natural hazard vulnerability assessment, as Becky was talking about. Exposure screens can help you identify the types of natural hazards that are most prevalent in your area and the locations and assets that are exposed to those natural hazards. Vulnerability assessments, as Becky was saying, can build on these exposure screens and help you assess your risks and the consequences to better understand the potential impacts and the criticality of your transportation assets and to start to identify possible adaptation strategies and solutions. I'll talk more about stakeholder engagement in more detail in a moment, but it's important to keep your internal and external stakeholders engaged. early in the process, as well as members of the public, and to share your results with them, because they might have specialized knowledge, local experiences, or observations about specific hazards or locations that can help you prioritize your problems and needs. So when looking at your peers, the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency in Cleveland, Ohio, the MPO known as NOACA, developed a risk assessment for its asset management program to better understand their risk for natural hazards. The Tri-Cities Area MPO in Petersburg, Virginia, just outside Richmond, use a regional hazard mitigation plan to make the decision to focus on hurricane events, because the mitigation plan showed that hurricanes, tornadoes, high winds, and flood events often occur simultaneously. So if they looked at hurricanes holistically, they could also address these other hazards. And then the Rockingham Planning Commission, a small MPO in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, used a vulnerability assessment to identify the transportation infrastructure located in areas potentially impacted by sea level rise, but also hurricane storm surge. And again, this is a coastal MPO, but the use of the vulnerability assessment might be something you would be interested in. So the next opportunity is looking at resilience when evaluating solutions and strategies. We understand that you are a solutions-oriented audience, so you might be particularly interested in this part. But when you're looking for resilience strategies and solutions, you might first consider establishing some evaluation criteria that align with your goals, objectives, measures, and targets that we talked about earlier, so that you can begin to solicit project proposals and prioritize your projects that you want to implement. And to find possible strategies, you might look through existing plans or strategies from your own agency or through your partners that have already been identified, or things that are underway or possibly need funding moving forward. After that, you could also issue a call for projects to solicit new ideas for projects and new proposals to bring into your plan and eventually into your TIP. And during your call for projects, you can encourage your project sponsors to develop proposals that specifically address a resilience issue, or you could encourage them to incorporate resilience into their project scope that might be focused on another transportation issue like congestion or safety or asset management. And another opportunity here is to evaluate these solutions using your evaluation criteria, and then start to prioritize these strategies for your plan and for your TIP based on the urgency of your resilience issues, the feasibility of implementation, and then also bringing in your stakeholder input. And so when we looked at resilience in our research, we saw 5 categories emerge, shown here at the bottom of the screen. The first strategy is to maintain and manage. This involves frequent, relatively low-cost activities to maintain assets and infrastructure in a state of good repair. These are typically performed within shorter timeframes, like fixing potholes or pre-treating roads when a freezing rain event or snowstorm is about to occur. This can also involve operational strategies that can help you be more responsive to hazards, such as real-time travel information systems or adaptive signal control. The redundancy strategy involves ensuring alternate routes and backup infrastructure and backup systems, so that a disruption to your system or the loss of an infrastructure asset will not shut down the entire network. This is a big consideration for emergency management and for evacuation planning. Protection involves installing protective measures to physically shield assets and infrastructure from expected hazards. These could be employing natural infrastructure, green infrastructure, or hard infrastructure. It could be installing wetlands and marshes and floodplains, or it could be constructing a retaining wall along a highway. Then accommodation, Dr. Dukes talked about this earlier. Accommodation involves changing plans or design standards or other aspects of operations in order to meet changing conditions with a continued level of performance. So this could be developing a stormwater management plan for your area, or updating standards for designing stronger, more durable bridges. And then finally, relocation involves either moving assets and infrastructure out of vulnerable locations to decrease their exposure. This can be a rather expensive option, as it could entail moving a roadway, realigning it, or moving a transit facility or another asset out of an at-risk area like a floodplain to a safer location. So with these strategies in mind, the next opportunity is to bring this into your transportation plan. So For MPOs, you have a 20-year planning horizon, and your plans are really good opportunities for you to anticipate these future threats and to start making policy and investment decisions to mitigate these risks and threats. Of course, your plan is also fiscally constrained, so it's important that you look at all available revenue sources from your local, state, and federal partners. My colleague Jim Thorne will talk more about this in a moment, about federal highway funding opportunities, but keep in mind that we provide funding for planning activities, for capital projects, for asset management, as well as for transportation technologies. Within the planning world, scenario planning is a growing practice for MPOs. Many MPOs simply look at a build and no build scenarios to help their investment decisions. Other MPOs, like the Hillsborough County MPO in Tampa, Florida, used a variety of scenarios to test future alternatives to look at the vulnerabilities and the impacts to their system, and then to adapt their planning decisions accordingly. So in addition to these long-range plans, there's opportunities to look at other planning studies like corridor studies, asset management plans, and other strategic plans. At the MPO level, you have your Unified Planning Work Program that details various planning activities that you will carry out using federal funds from Federal Highway and Federal Transit Administration. You might consider in the future funding a natural hazard exposure screen or a natural hazard vulnerability assessment as part of your UPWP. You also have the option to conduct corridor studies and sub-area plans with federal funds. As we saw with the MTC in San Francisco, the MPO, they brought resilience into a corridor study along a state highway that also looked at safety, congestion, and freight movement. And so Becky mentioned earlier about state DOTs are now required to develop risk-based asset management plans. We've also seen instances where MPOs have their own asset management program or plan, and they've brought resilience into that. Looking again at Cleveland, NOACA has brought resilience into its not only its strategic plan and long-range transportation plan, but also its asset management plan and its water quality strategic plan. So making sure that these documents are coordinated and aligned for integrated decision making. And then in New Jersey, we have the North Jersey Transportation Planning Agency, also known as NJTPA. They've brought resilience into their regional capital investment strategy that they use for making funding decisions. So your long-range plan and these corridor studies and other planning efforts can help inform your TIP. And again, your TIP describes all of your projects that you'll be funding in your metropolitan area over the next 4-year time frame. When putting together your TIP, it's important that you have a uniform and consistent way for looking at project costs and project benefits so that you can prioritize projects and maximize your funding. So thinking back to that evaluation criteria, bringing that forward into your TIP development process as well, and looking at the full range of life cycle costs and benefits that resilience projects can bring in addition to other transportation projects. As Becky mentioned earlier, with the periodic evaluations of damaged facilities, as you develop your TIP, it's important to identify any roads or highways or bridges that repeatedly require repair and reconstruction due to emergency events, to see if there are reasonable alternatives that can help you mitigate the root cause of that recurring damage. So this will help you inform your decision on how to move forward with that project and how to move forward within the project development process. Again, looking at your peers in Boston, Massachusetts, the Boston Region MPO uses its own all hazards planning application tool that it developed. It's an online GIS mapping tool, and they use it to assess the exposure of projects to natural hazards, such as flooding, hurricane storm surges, earthquakes, sea level rise, as they are developing their TIPs. In Somersville, West Virginia, the Fayette Raleigh MPO uses a GIS system to assess whether projects are located in FEMA's 100-year floodplain. So there's a range of options here for looking at projects that are being delivered through your TIP. So now looking at project development, I understand that as MPOs, your role in project development is different than that of a state DOT or a local public agency. You are typically more of a facilitator of the planning and programming process. You don't typically deliver projects, but even so, there are opportunities for you to work with your project partners and to encourage them to consider resilience and project designs, encourage them to conduct their own natural hazard exposure screening, or to use the results of a of your own exposure screening or vulnerability assessments, and then to talk about resilience as they do their outreach for their designs and final plans. And as projects move through the NEPA requirements or the National Environmental Policy Act, they might be able to use the data and the modeling and the information from your planning process to help inform their environmental review process. So one example I'll cite here is with the Miami-Dade MPO in Florida. They worked with stakeholders to develop a uniform set of excuse me, standard resilience guidelines and objectives for designing future transportation projects. And they adopted that into their local comprehensive development master plan, so that when project engineers were designing projects for the future, they were all looking at the same uniform design requirements, looking at resilience, and specifically in Miami, looking at flooding and storm surge and sea level rise. So the next opportunity here is looking at monitoring and reporting. These activities help you measure the effects of your efforts over time and to identify improvements while keeping your stakeholders and the public informed. A big part of this is tracking hazards and infrastructure conditions over time and measuring your progress towards achieving your goals, objectives, measures, and targets as you implement projects and as you manage your assets. It's important to keep policymakers, stakeholders, and the public informed of your agency's progress, and then reporting can help you maintain transparency and accountability as you build support for your agency's plans moving forward. And with reporting, you can take an informal approach with either website updates or social media posts, fact sheets or infographics, or you can take a more formal approach with more formal periodic progress reports or updates to your long-range transportation plans, or even making presentations directly to your key policymakers, your stakeholders, and the public. And so if you're considering making monitoring and reporting a big part of your MPO planning process, you might consider starting with a monitoring and reporting plan. This can help you outline what activities, conditions, and events that you want to be tracking, what data you need to collect, who will collect that data, how they will collect it, and how often they will collect that data. And then it will also help you outline how that data will be used within your planning process and how you intend on sharing it with your stakeholders and policymakers and members of the public. Again, looking at your peers, NOACA and Cleveland, Ohio is currently establishing a steering committee of local partners, the Ohio Department of Transportation and also Federal Highway, to help develop performance measures and targets to help them monitor and report their progress. Again, in New Jersey, NJTPA is part of a coalition called Together North Jersey. This coalition is over 100 different agency partners that has a regional vision for resiliency, and they meet quarterly to talk about their progress implementing strategies in the North Jersey region. So next, I'll wrap up by talking about stakeholder engagement, which is a continuing part of this planning process. The opportunity here is to raise awareness of your region's needs, while also building support and expanding your network of partners. A lot of agencies start by identifying champions within their agency. That might be a staff member or somebody in a leadership position like an executive director or an elected official. Internally at MPOs, you might also see staff members that have designated responsibilities for resilience, or maybe you might have an internal committee that's focused specifically on resilience. Externally, you could also have an interagency working group or an advisory committee with your state DOT, your transit agencies, your local government partners, maybe some of those other federal and state partners like FEMA and like the Indiana Department of Homeland Security. Just remember that stakeholder engagement is a two-way street, so it's important to bring people into your process, but also to get involved in their processes. So look at opportunities that you can be a resource for your partners. Just as we talked about with reporting, keeping the public informed is essential to this. This means reaching out to your constituents and making them aware of what you're working on, but it also means bringing them into your process to hear about their experiences and to understand their needs and their challenges and their priorities, especially those populations that have economic and physical and social barriers to accessing transportation services. So The thinking here is not only about vulnerable infrastructure and assets, but it's also about vulnerable populations as well. And so you might already have some good public involvement strategies in place at your MPO, but you might also have to get creative with how you engage people to help extend your reach to all members of your community. And looking at examples, again, in Miami, Florida, the MPO there hosted a series of workshops in developing their long-range plan to help them prioritize their 8 goal areas, with resiliency being part of that. Again, in Cleveland, Nowaka, they did a survey across their partners at the Ohio DOT and Federal Highway and the local cities and counties to look at the risk for natural hazards and to help bring that into their asset management risk assessment. And then in Somersville, West Virginia, the Fayette Raleigh MPO, they did a more informal survey where they just brought their local jurisdictions together to ask them about flood-prone assets that the MPO might have missed as they were doing their GIS analysis. So using some of that anecdotal local knowledge to supplement their more quantitative data analyses. So again, the idea here is to help you meet our federal requirements for planning, but also to help you build stronger, more robust, more reliable transportation systems that are safe and resilient for all transportation users. So now I'll invite my colleague Jim Thorne to share some ideas on how Federal Highway can help you and your partners bring resilience into your planning process.
Great, thank you, Corbin. Appreciate that. Good to be here and appreciate the opportunity to share some time with everyone today to talk about resilience. And I guess some kudos to Joyce and Sally for leveraging the technology, this virtual format, to bring us all together, because it's I don't think it's likely that all 4 of us could have shown up in an in-person meeting. So it was helpful for me to hear from my colleagues about some of the work they're doing and to share a little bit today. So again, I'm Jim Thorne with Federal Highway Office of Planning. I'm on the Transportation Planning and Capacity Building team. And our program is about supporting planners and decision makers as they implement the transportation planning process. And along the way, we hope we advance the state of the practice and we help get better planning and better outcomes for all the communities that we're working in. So I'm going to share some of the resources that are you might find helpful in doing that. And I'm going to cover four main things. One is the idea of funding eligibility that's been referenced already. How might you find funds to support resilience planning efforts? The second will be information on a website. So I'm going to talk about planning eligibility, a website that I hope is old news to you, but it's got some new twists. And then I'm going to talk about a tool that I think you might find interesting, particularly if you're interested in doing a self-assessment of your planning process or your plan to see, well, how does this planning that we do support the environmental, economic, and social aspects of our community. So I'll talk a little bit about that tool. And fourth, kind of reinforce some of the examples and steps that Corbin provided with a link and a reference to a NCHRP project that hopefully sounds familiar to a lot of you that we've been working with recently. All right, so that's the plan. So real quick, first we'll talk about funding eligibility. And there is a Federal Highway memorandum that came out just over 8 years ago in 2012. It's entitled Eligibility of Activities to Adapt to Climate Change and Extreme Weather Events under the Federal Aid and Federal Lands Highway Program. It was a joint memorandum between the Offices of Infrastructure, Planning, Environment, Realty, and Federal Lands Highways. And it generally talks about the ability to use federal funds to support adaptation and resilience kind of efforts related to climate change or extreme weather kind of events. I've got the link there that you can read. It's maybe 10 or so pages. It's in a question and answer kind of format, covers quite a range of topics, including providing examples of specific funds of categories of funds like planning and state planning and research funds. And the examples that are provided in this slide are those that are provided from that Q&A that says you can conduct vulnerability or risk kind of assessments. You can update relevant kind of data using PL funds or SPR funds. And then some examples from the Surface Transportation Block Grant kinds of activities about considering climate change, extreme weather events and project development, including environmental review and design work, right-of-way acquisition, and construction of projects or features to protect existing eligible assets from impacts and damage associated with climate change, etc. So there's a lot of information in that Q&A. I'd encourage you to take a look at that. A keynote is if Federal Highway provides states and MPOs, when you're thinking of PL funds, the discretion and flexibility to apply those planning funds, and that's subject to agreement approval with the Indiana Division Office. And as always, you'd want to be in consultation and talking with those folks as you go through that process. So that is about planning eligibility. Why don't we go on and talk about a website and a planning portal in the next slide. And I hope this is familiar to you. Transportation Planning Capacity Building. That's the program within Federal Highways Office of Planning that tries to support the planning profession to bring together, sort of be a clearinghouse of all the stuff we know about transportation planning. Planning.dot.gov is the link that you want to have in your favorites on your desktop. It has been recently updated. If you haven't been there in a while, it's been updated in the last year. It has a lot of new resources, a new format, new look. It's really hip and cool now. One of the things you'll see put up early is this thing on peer events. We call them peer exchanges, peer workshops, peer roundtables. There are all kinds of ways that these can happen. In the past, these were all in-person kind of things, and Federal Highways would help make the connections. You know, you would have a problem, we would work, you would apply to the peer program, we would try and find folks that have already worked through that problem or had a solution that was of interest to you, and then we would bring you together to talk about it, and then hopefully share that experience with the larger planning community through some documentation or report, right? Well, this year we're doing those virtually, and so far it's been going pretty well. And you can apply online today to conduct a peer event on your topic of interest, the challenge that you are facing. And again, those can take all different kinds of forms. It's not just one thing, so it's only limited by your creativity in submitting that application. So given today's topic, if you had something of interest, you could certainly consider submitting a peer application to do that. And again, our idea is to try and bring folks together, practitioners, to share common experiences and figure out, you know, how do we learn from each other and take steps forward. The website is also a clearinghouse of everything we have, either research projects we've done and sponsored, those done by others like NCHRP. It has training resources that are available. So I do encourage you to take a look at that. I used the search feature on the capacity building website and just typed in resilience, and this nifty report came up. This was in probably the top 3 that I cut and pasted the table at the bottom of the page that shows summary of MPO and DOT integration of resilience into planning steps table. So this is taken from a report that shows up on the capacity building website. It's a report that was mentioned earlier this morning. I thought it was interesting because it shows a survey that was done as part of this effort, and this was in the last 2 years, about how resilience is showing up in transportation planning processes. So it shows out of DOT, 17 out of 52 surveyed had a goal or objective related to resilience. 45 out of 101 MPOs that were surveyed had a resilience kind of goal and objective. I'd be curious what that looks like in Indiana. Do you think about your existing transportation plan? Do you have resilience related goals? And it may not use the term resilience, but what might they look like? That would be interesting to see. So you can go on a treasure hunt and find that table in that report on the capacity building website. And I'm not going to tell you what it is. You have to find it on your own, but it's in the last 2 years, just to give you a hint there. You know, I heard the reference earlier to scenario planning, and another recent document you'll find on the capacity building website is something called scenario planning or next generation scenario planning. And it was a research project conducted by Federal Highways to look at how the use of scenario planning has evolved and how it's being applied by MPOs to think about some of these bigger issues like the impacts of continuous and autonomous vehicles or changing climate and how you might think about those in a transportation planning process. So you can find that next generation scenario planning report on the capacity building website as well. And one last comment on the peer events. There was an MPO with Indiana that has initiated and hosted a capacity supported peer event in the last year or so, and I'll leave that as a mystery for you to find who that is on the website. So that is the planning portal, and that's sort of our key place to hold all the stuff. So if you have any questions about what's going on in Federal Highways planning resources, take a look at the capacity building website. So next, going to talk about a tool that Federal Highways has developed, and this tool's been around for a while, and it's on, I should know what iteration it is on now, but it's been out there and available. It's been updated. It's had the involvement of a lot of practitioners from around the country, and that is called INVEST. And I think you've heard of this before. I hope you've heard of this before, but INVEST is, Federal Highways INVEST tool is the Infrastructure Voluntary Evaluation Sustainability Tool. It's a web-based self-assessment tool that you can use to see how are you doing in meeting those economic, social, and environmental needs of your community. It looks at everything from the planning process through project development to design and construction through operations and maintenance. And it basically represents all the best, they're called criteria, but they're best practices associated with doing all those things. Like in the planning world or regional planning, it has a number of criteria that talk about those things that represent best practices when you do transportation planning. It assumes that you're already doing all the required stuff, but if you want to really address all those needs and demonstrate a sustainable approach, it documents a lot of best practices being used around the country. And what I show on the page here is a link to the INVEST tool, sustainablehighways.org. And I picked out one of the planning criteria, and here's a question for you. On the INVEST tool, when it talks about transportation planning, how many criteria does it take to define transportation planning within the INVEST framework? So that's your homework assignment over lunch. Figure what that is. This criteria is system planning. Number 16 is on infrastructure resilience, and it has 6 activities related to demonstrating or addressing infrastructure resilience, things like develop and adopt goals and objectives, coordinate with partner agencies, et cetera, et cetera. And I did you a bit of a disservice by, I just took out the titles out of the INVEST criteria and presented them here because there's a lot of background information. So this is multiple pages that talk about each of these and has background information and definitions and links and case studies that talks about each of these steps that will help you get better grounded in what this might mean. And we heard the reference earlier to NCT COG, and I recall a couple of years ago talking as part of an event in Texas, and they shared that they had used the INVEST tool to look at their planning process, and they felt pretty good about everything they were doing, that when they did their self-assessment, how they compared and how they scored and so forth. One of the gaps that it did identify for them was their need to be more attentive to infrastructure resilience. So that initiated in their next planning cycle to be more thoughtful about resilience and look at these kind of criteria. So take a look at INVEST overall as a helpful tool, and then you can look specifically at SPR 16 to see what it suggests you might do related to infrastructure resilience, okay? That's the tool. And now let's go on to talk about a possible framework for thinking about resilience. And this is consistent with what Corbin just reviewed, those multiple steps in that planning diagram. And I hope that planning cycle looked familiar because I think it's very similar to the one you'll find in the Federal Highway Federal Transit briefing book, which is on the capacity building website. That planning cycle steps, all of those, that's taken from that briefing book, which I think is our most popular document on the capacity building website, and that was updated in the last year as well. So we have this effort on safety, and two thoughts here. Safety is important to Federal Highways. I know it's important to you, and it should be a topic of every meeting we have to talk about transportation safety. And your third quiz question of the day is how many fatalities in Indiana, and the last number I have is from 2018, right? Because safety is important and we should do something about it. Well, Indiana has demonstrated leadership in trying to do something about safety by initiating an effort or taking advantage of a federal highway program to support transportation safety planning, and that is happening this year. the Federal Highway Offices of Planning and Safety have been working together for a few years now to support workshops to help get DOTs and MPOs together to figure out, are we doing all we can in the planning process to integrate safety and get better safety outcomes? And we've been doing these workshops around the country, and this year Indiana stepped up and said, we would like to do that. So we've been working with the Indiana Department of Transportation, the Federal Highway Division Office, the MPO Council, and the MPOs in Indiana to convene workshops to look at safety. And we held this virtual workshop on June 23rd, 24th. I started to say where that was. It was virtual. You used to say that. We had this workshop in virtual land. So we have this workshop on 23rd and 24th of this year. We'll have a follow-up technical assistance workshop in a little bit. And we had about 50 folks that joined us for that. We had a lot of great examples shared from around Indiana on how safety was being advanced. Now, for those that participated or those that didn't, the principles that we talked about, the how do you incorporate safety in the planning, were derived from this NCHRP report 811, which is about institutionalizing safety into transportation planning. And I've summarized the principles down below. There are 7. If you're at the workshop, they may have been worded a little bit differently. I tried to keep them simple and so they would fit one line, that kind of thing. But it's basic about involving experts, use of data and analysis, visions and goals, performance measures that you're using as a decision factor when you evaluate projects in the plan or the TIP. So one, kudos to Indiana for stepping forward and being aggressive on doing something about safety. And then that's for the Federal Highway Division Office, Indiana Department of Transportation, and all the MPOs that have been participating in that. If you haven't been involved and you want to be involved, we'll be having a follow-up webinar in a couple months, and you're welcome to participate in that and just connect with Joyce Newland and she'll help make that happen. Okay, so here's the thought, and I'm going around the bend here, so stay close, stick with me. What if we took these principles about institutionalizing safety in the planning, if we went advance to the next slide, and we change safety to resilience, all right? And I think if you look through that and think about what Corbin just talked about, all those steps in the planning process, and you thought about this NCHRP project that's been a couple of years looking at how do you institutionalize something like safety in the planning, I think you'll see some real consistency between these steps. It's about getting the right experts, stakeholders involved, the use of data that we've heard a little bit about this morning, having some a goal-driven process, performance measures if you're interested, and documenting that in the, whether it's your plan, a corridor plan, a bike ped study, whatever, freight study, whatever that might be, and then using it as a decision factor when you do the plan and TIP, etc. So I think you've seen these talked about when Corbin reviewed those steps. They may have been a sub-step. They may have been framed a little differently, but it's the same kind of idea. So I'm going to suggest that that might be something to think about that you could do today. And an overall theme in this whole thing, and I think it applies whether you're talking about safety or you're talking about resilience, is a choose your own kind of adventure approach, that the context you're in, the place you're in, with the resources you have and the needs and demands and all that kind of stuff, which of these makes sense in that environment and what would be the best next step for you? And I think there's a lot of stuff there. And again, thinking through the examples that Heather and Becky and Corbin have already covered, it's just kind of finding the thread, link them together, and what's the best next step for you to take to do something. And I guess that's it. How do you implement this into the planning? And here's a possible approach, next step to do that. And I think that is the next slide would be the contact information. Well, so thank you, and we do thank you for sharing some, letting us share some time with you today. And we hope to have a little bit of time to talk about this. If you have comments or questions, let's take advantage of that. And I'll go back to our host to see what do we need to do to, or if you have any questions that have been entered in the chat.
At this time, we have one question.
The question is there a rubric or evaluation criteria guide FHWA has released for uniform evaluation metrics? And in my, one thing I failed to do, and I was talk about the basics of a vulnerability assessment. And so just to step back a few steps here, these agencies that are undertaking these vulnerability assessments, and a lot of vulnerability assessments have certain things in common. They look at exposure, they look at sensitivity, and they look at adaptive capacity for their transportation assets. And exposure is like something like, is the asset exposed? Is it within a 100-year floodplain? Is it, you know, in an area that's experiencing some increase in heat or increase in rainfall? And then, is it sensitive? You know, maybe an indicator of sensitivity might be, what's the culvert condition? Or you know, is it even affected by something like change in precipitation or change in heat, increase in heat? Is it sensitive to those things? And then adaptive capacity is, you know, how can it cope? How can this asset cope, or the system cope with this type of disruption? You know, what's the detour length if this asset's out? Can it recover quickly? What's the AADT of that facility? You know, is it a really important asset that it would be tough for the system to be able to handle a disruption to it? So when agencies are undertaking vulnerability assessments, they look at these things and then they kind of evaluate their assets based on these in either a qualitative way or a quantitative way. And qualitatively, you know, they might kind of just talk to experts and get their, you know, talk to their maintenance folks, if it's a transportation agency, if it's a DOT, or, you know, talk to folks who know about, know these assets well, you know, where have they seen these disruptions? What do they know about the sensitivity of certain facilities and assets? Or they could do something called an indicator-based approach to vulnerability assessment, where they actually have, they rank assets on these things. And so Federal Highways has this tool. It's called the Vulnerability Assessment Scoring Tool, which is or VAST, we call it. And it's available on our website, and you can download it and play around with it if you're interested. And several transportation agencies have used this tool. Several MPOs and DOTs and have used the spreadsheet tool or a version of it. And what it lists is potential indicators for exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity that agencies might be interested in, or agencies could come up with their own indicators. And so it provides some suggestions, and then it helps guide the agency through the process of like scoring those providing scores or uploading scores for those indicators for each asset and or each link in your transportation network, and then weighting those and coming up with some kind of measure or ranking of vulnerability of your assets. So long-winded way of saying that we do have that tool as well as a guidebook to it up on our website. And so I encourage you to check that out if you're interested. And we reference it in the vulnerability assessment framework. Also, we have a white paper that we developed as part of the development of the guidebook, the Resilience and Planning Guidebook that Corbin presented a lot of resources from. And the white paper lists a lot of performance metrics that states, MPOs and state DOTs have used for their in their transportation planning process that relate to resilience. So I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in that. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, I am not seeing any more questions from the audience here.